An ordinary call. It was a humid summer evening in Atlanta, Georgia, the kind of night where the air felt thick and electric, buzzing with the energy of a city that refused to sleep. Crowds bustled along the streets, some on their way to trendy downtown bars while others hurried home from late shifts. The glow of streetlights reflected off rain-slicked pavements, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere. For Officer Rick Donovan, a 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, it was just another night on patrol. Or so he thought. Rick leaned back in the driver's seat of his cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping in after another long day on the force. His routine had become a predictable grind: traffic stops, noise complaints, and the occasional petty theft. At 42, he had seen it all, or so he believed. Tonight, he was counting down the minutes to the end of his shift. The prospect of a cold beer and the comfort of his recliner beckoned him home. But fate had other plans. The crackle of his police radio shattered the momentary calm. Unit 57, report of a suspicious individual loitering near Peachtree and Fifth Avenue. Black Mercedes parked. Request assistance. Rick let out an audible groan. It was 7:45 p.m., only 15 minutes until his shift ended. He debated passing the call to the next officer on duty but eventually grabbed the radio and acknowledged the dispatch. Unit 57 en route, he said, flipping on his lights. He pulled into traffic, weaving through the maze of one-way streets that defined downtown Atlanta. Probably just another vagrant, Rick muttered to himself. It wasn't uncommon for him to be called out for late-night disturbances that turned out to be nothing, just people minding their own business in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still, duty called. When he approached the intersection, his headlights illuminated the black Mercedes described in the report. Parked under a dim streetlight, the vehicle looked immaculate, its glossy surface reflecting the muted glow of the city. Standing next to it was a tall black woman, her posture straight, exuding a quiet confidence. She wore a crisp white suit, the kind that screamed money and success. Her blonde highlighted hair was neatly styled, and she held a sleek smartphone in one hand, scrolling with a casual air. Rick felt an inexplicable surge of annoyance. Something about her calm demeanor set him on edge, as if she didn't belong in the narrative he had already crafted in his head. He stepped out of his cruiser, the sound of his boots hitting the wet pavement echoing in the quiet night. Adjusting his utility belt, he approached her, his face hard and unreadable. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here?" His tone was firm, not aggressive, but there was an edge to it, a hint of skepticism. The woman looked up from her phone, her expression unbothered, almost serene. Her eyes met his with a steady, unwavering gaze. "Good evening, officer," she said smoothly, her voice calm and articulate. "I'm waiting for someone." Rick's brow furrowed slightly. Her poise caught him off guard. He wasn't used to such composed responses. "May I see some identification?" he asked, holding out his hand. Without hesitation, she reached into her sleek leather handbag and pulled out a driver's license. Rick glanced at the name, Dr. Olivia Monroe. The title didn't register with him. He handed the ID back without much thought, focusing instead on the situation at hand. "Dr. Monroe, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," Rick said, his tone slightly firmer now. Olivia frowned, a hint of irritation crossing her otherwise composed features. "Officer, I've complied with your request. I've provided my identification, and I'm standing here, doing nothing illegal. Why do I need to move?" Rick felt his patience thinning. He had dealt with enough people questioning his authority to recognize the beginning of a challenge. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," he said, stepping closer. "Step away from the vehicle." Olivia held her ground, her voice remaining calm but firm. "Officer, I believe you're escalating a situation unnecessarily. I've done nothing wrong." The calmness of her voice only fueled Rick's frustration. He reached out and grabbed her arm, intending to guide her away from the car. The moment his hand made contact, Olivia winced, pulling back slightly. "This is unnecessary," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The sound of murmurs drew Rick's attention. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Some of them had their phones out, recording the scene. Rick felt a flash of unease but quickly pushed it aside. He was doing his job, and he wasn't about to let an audience intimidate him. "Ma'am, step back," Rick repeated, his grip tightening slightly on her arm. "Officer," Olivia said, her tone sharper now, "I suggest you let go of me. This is not going to end the way you think." Her words caught him off guard, but he refused to show it. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "It's a fact," Olivia replied, her gaze piercing. "And you might want to think carefully before you take this any further." The tension between them was palpable, the quiet hum of the city around them a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere of their exchange. Rick released her arm, a sliver of doubt creeping into his mind. Who was this woman? And why did she seem so unshaken, so certain? The crowd murmured louder, some voices calling out in protest. "Leave her alone, man," someone shouted. "She ain't done nothing wrong." Rick turned toward the crowd, his face flushing with frustration. "Move along, folks. Nothing to see here," he barked. But he knew there was plenty to see. Too much. Back at the precinct, Rick couldn't shake the encounter. He processed Dr. Monroe's paperwork quickly, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something about her composure, her calm defiance, unsettled him. She didn't fit the profile of the people he usually dealt with during late-night patrols. He stared at her driver's license, her title staring back at him like a challenge, Dr. Olivia Monroe. He pushed the thought aside, rationalizing that it didn't matter. A title didn't excuse suspicious behavior. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Olivia sat with her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget or look anxious. In fact, she looked as if she were waiting for something, or someone. The unease Rick had felt earlier returned with full force when his commanding officer, Captain Harris, burst into the precinct with an expression that could only be described as panic. "Donovan!" Harris barked, his voice cutting through the usual din of the station. "Where's Dr. Monroe?" Rick blinked, confused. "In holding," he replied. "Why? What's going on?" Harris's face darkened. "You've made a huge mistake, Rick. Do you have any idea who she is?" Rick felt his stomach drop. "She said she's a doctor," he muttered, though the words sounded weak even to his own ears. Harris glared at him. "She's not just any doctor, you idiot. She's Dr. Olivia Monroe, a federal attorney, and one of the most influential civil rights advocates in the country. And you've just detained her without cause." The color drained from Rick's face as Harris's words sank in. Federal attorney. Civil rights advocate. Influence beyond anything he could comprehend. The weight of his actions hit him like a freight train. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. The calm before the storm. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed faintly as Officer Rick Donovan sat frozen in his chair, Captain Harris's words echoing in his mind. "You've made a huge mistake." The weight of the situation pressed on him, suffocating and unforgiving. He replayed the encounter with Dr. Olivia Monroe in his head, every decision, every word, every action. In hindsight, it all felt like a colossal misstep. "I'll take care of it," Harris snapped, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You've put us in a bad spot, Donovan. This isn't just about you, it's about the department." Harris turned and stormed out, leaving Rick alone with his thoughts. The precinct's usual hum of activity seemed distant now, like white noise drowned out by the pounding of his heart. He glanced at the holding cell area, where Olivia Monroe still sat, composed and calm as though she were merely waiting for a dinner reservation. Her posture was straight, her expression serene. There wasn't a trace of fear or anger, only an unsettling certainty that unnerved him. Rick rubbed his temples and reached for his coffee, but the cup was empty. He tossed it into the trash can with more force than necessary, frustration bubbling under his skin. He had been doing this job for 15 years, navigating Atlanta streets, dealing with all kinds of people, making split-second decisions. How could one encounter unravel everything he thought he knew about himself and his instincts? Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Olivia Monroe remained unflappable. Her gaze drifted to the clock on the wall, her mind calm but focused. She knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. She had dealt with situations like this before, situations where assumptions and biases clashed with authority, where her identity and influence unsettled those who underestimated her. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was patient. Her phone, confiscated during her detainment, had already set off a chain reaction. Olivia knew that by now, several people in her circle, colleagues, friends, and powerful allies, were already working to rectify the injustice. Olivia's assistant, Marla, would have seen the missed calls and the cryptic text Olivia had managed to send during her brief wait at the scene, detained. Atlanta PD. You know what to do. And Marla did know. Within minutes, the machinery of Olivia's network was in motion. At the precinct, things were beginning to unravel. News of Olivia's detention spread like wildfire after bystander videos of the encounter hit social media. Clips showing Rick grabbing Olivia's arm and her composed yet firm responses had gone viral within hours, sparking outrage. The hashtags #JusticeForOlivia and #AtlantaPD began trending nationwide. Prominent civil rights organizations and activists chimed in, demanding accountability. Rick wasn't entirely oblivious. He could feel the shift in the air as officers whispered amongst themselves, glancing in his direction with expressions that ranged from discomfort to outright disdain. He wanted to believe it was exaggerated, that this would blow over with a simple apology and an explanation. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't going away. By late evening, the precinct was no longer a quiet hub of routine work. Journalists began gathering outside, cameras ready, questions already forming. Captain Harris called an emergency meeting, pulling Rick into his office alongside the department's legal advisor and public relations officer. "Rick," Harris began, his tone heavy, "I've spent my career cleaning up messes, but this is something else. Do you understand what you've done?" Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered, his voice defensive but hollow. "She was acting suspicious. I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Harris shot back, his voice rising. "Grabbing a woman who showed you her ID, complied with your requests, and did nothing wrong? That's protocol." Rick opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He had no defense that didn't sound hollow, no justification that could hold up under scrutiny. The department's legal advisor, a wiry man in a gray suit named Alan Parks, interjected. "We need to think strategically here," he said, his voice measured. "Dr. Monroe is a public figure with a spotless reputation. She's respected, connected, and, most importantly, right. The video evidence already paints a bad picture, and the public isn't going to be kind. What are we supposed to do?" Rick asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Apologize and hope she doesn't sue?" Alan sighed. "Apology or not, we're already dealing with the fallout. Civil rights attorneys are likely drafting statements as we speak. Lawsuits are the least of your worries, Officer Donovan. This is about the court of public opinion. And right now, you're losing." Rick leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being on this side of the table, the one under scrutiny. For years, he had been the enforcer, the authority. Now, he felt small, powerless in the face of the consequences unfolding around him. In the holding area, Olivia's patience was rewarded. Marla arrived at the precinct with 2 attorneys in tow, both sharp-dressed and sharp-tongued. The lead attorney, Samuel Grant, was a force to be reckoned with, his reputation as a fierce advocate for justice preceding him. "Dr. Monroe," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm as he approached the holding cell. "We're here to get you out of this mess." Olivia stood, smoothing the creases in her suit. "I've been waiting," she said, her tone light but laced with irony. Within minutes, Samuel and his team were in Captain Harris's office, demanding Olivia's immediate release. Harris, already beleaguered by the mounting pressure, didn't put up much of a fight. By the time Olivia walked out of the precinct, flanked by her legal team, the crowd of journalists outside had doubled. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward her as reporters shouted questions. Olivia paused briefly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I have no comment at this time," she said evenly. "But I will say this, accountability matters. Justice matters. And we're not done here." Her words were measured, deliberate. She wasn't just addressing the reporters, she was sending a message to Rick, to the department, to everyone watching. This wasn't over. Back inside, Rick watched the scene unfold on a television in the break room. His chest tightened as he saw Olivia's composed demeanor, the way she commanded the crowd's attention with ease. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. For the first time in years, Rick felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: regret. Not just for the immediate consequences, but for the choices and biases that had led him to this moment. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and did his duty. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he couldn't ignore the cracks in his self-perception. As the evening wore on, Rick sat alone at his desk, staring at the blank incident report in front of him. He didn't know what to write, how to explain what had happened in a way that didn't sound like an excuse. For the first time, he realized that his actions had consequences far beyond himself. He had shaken the trust of the community he was sworn to protect, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. The unraveling. The next morning, the city of Atlanta woke up to the story of Dr. Olivia Monroe's detention, and the fallout was immediate. News stations looped the viral video of the incident, showing Officer Rick Donovan grabbing Olivia's arm as she calmly questioned his authority. The footage, paired with Olivia's composed response and the murmurs of an outraged crowd, painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Every corner of the city buzzed with conversation. At coffee shops, on public buses, in the break rooms of office buildings, people debated what had happened. For some, it was a stark reminder of the systemic inequalities embedded in law enforcement. For others, it was an embarrassing overstep by a veteran officer who should have known better. For Rick Donovan, it was the beginning of a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. Rick woke up to dozens of missed calls and text messages. He groaned as he sat up in bed, the events of the previous night rushing back like a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was real, and now it was everywhere. He scrolled through his phone, his heart sinking as he read messages from colleagues, friends, and even family members. Most were a mix of concern and disbelief. A few were accusatory. One message stood out, a text from his sister. "Rick, what were you thinking? Call me. We need to talk." Rick threw his phone onto the bed and rubbed his face with his hands. He hadn't even begun to process the incident himself, and now the world seemed determined to weigh in. At the same time, Olivia Monroe was sitting in a conference room at a downtown law firm, surrounded by her team. The room was buzzing with activity, phones ringing, laptops open to news articles and social media threads, coffee cups scattered across the table. Olivia sat at the head of the table, her expression calm but focused. "We need to control the narrative," said Samuel Grant, her lead attorney. "The video is already out there, and public opinion is on our side. But we need to make sure this isn't just a flash in the pan. This can be bigger than one incident." Olivia nodded. "I agree," she said. "This isn't about me. It's about what this represents. We need to use this moment to push for real change. Marla, Olivia's assistant, chimed in. We've already had inquiries from several civil rights organizations. They want to partner with us to amplify the story. Good, Olivia said. Let's work with them. But I want to make sure we're strategic about this. It's not just about public outrage, it's about turning that outrage into action. Samuel leaned forward. What's the plan, Olivia? Are we filing a lawsuit? Olivia considered this for a moment. Not yet, she said finally. A lawsuit is part of the strategy, but it's not the first step. First, we need accountability. I want a public apology from the department, and I want to know what they're going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You think they'll give you that without a fight? Olivia's eyes hardened. They won't have a choice. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Captain Harris was in full damage control mode. He had spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, city officials, and even the mayor's office. The pressure was mounting, and he knew the department's reputation was on the line. Rick sat in Harris's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The captain paced back and forth, his frustration evident. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've created? Harris snapped. The mayor called me this morning. The mayor, Rick. And do you know what she said? She said this department is a national embarrassment. Rick flinched but said nothing. He had no defense, no justification that could withstand the scrutiny they were now under. Harris stopped pacing and fixed Rick with a hard stare. I need to know exactly what happened last night, he said. Every detail. No sugarcoating, no excuses. Rick hesitated, then began recounting the incident. As he spoke, he realized how thin his reasoning sounded, how his actions had been driven more by assumptions than actual evidence. By the time he finished, Harris looked even angrier. You grabbed her because you thought she was suspicious, Harris repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. A woman standing next to a Mercedes, wearing a business suit, minding her own damn business. That's what you call suspicious? Rick opened his mouth to respond but closed it again. There was nothing he could say. Harris let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. Rick, I've covered for you in the past. I've looked the other way on some of your screw-ups because I thought you were a good cop at heart. But this? This isn't just a screw-up. This is a career-ending disaster. Rick felt a pang of fear. What are you saying, Captain? I'm saying you're on thin ice, Harris replied. The department is under fire, and you're the face of this mess. If you want any chance of salvaging your career, you need to start owning up to your mistakes. As the day wore on, the pressure on the department continued to escalate. Protesters began gathering outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "Justice for Olivia," and "End Police Bias." News vans lined the streets, reporters broadcasting live updates as the crowd grew larger and louder. Inside, Rick sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. He could hear the chants outside, the voices calling for his resignation. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his actions and their consequences. For the first time, Rick began to question not just his actions, but his beliefs. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who upheld the law and treated people fairly. But now, faced with the reality of his choices, he couldn't ignore the biases that had influenced him. He thought about Olivia Monroe, her calm demeanor, her refusal to be intimidated, and realized that he had underestimated her, dismissed her, because of his own assumptions. Rick's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his desk. He looked up to see Alan Parks, the department's legal advisor, standing over him. "We need to talk," Alan said. "Captain Harris wants you to prepare a public statement. This situation isn't going away, and the department needs to show the public that we're taking it seriously." Rick nodded numbly. "What do I say?" "You start by apologizing," Alan said bluntly. Not just to Dr. Monroe, but to the community. You acknowledge your mistakes and take responsibility for your actions. And you do it with sincerity, Rick. No excuses, no deflections. Just honesty. Rick swallowed hard. He had never been good at admitting when he was wrong, but he knew he didn't have a choice. This was his chance to start making things right, or at least to try. By the end of the day, Rick found himself standing in front of a podium, cameras flashing and microphones pointed at him. The crowd outside the precinct had grown even larger, their chants a constant backdrop to the scene. Rick took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium to steady himself. "My name is Officer Rick Donovan," he began, his voice shaky but audible. "Last night, I made a mistake. I detained Dr. Olivia Monroe without cause, and my actions were wrong. I want to apologize to Dr. Monroe, to the community, and to everyone who has been affected by this incident." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I have spent years on this force, believing that I was serving and protecting the people of this city. But last night, I failed to live up to that responsibility. I let my assumptions and biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." As Rick spoke, Olivia watched the press conference from her office, her expression unreadable. She had seen apologies like this before, some sincere, others hollow. Time would tell which one this was. A catalyst for change. As Rick Donovan stepped down from the podium, the flash of cameras and the murmurs of reporters blurred together into an indistinct hum. His apology hung in the humid evening air, lingering not just for the crowd but for himself. The words had been sincere, but he wasn't sure if they were enough, not for Olivia Monroe, not for the community, and certainly not for his own conscience. Inside her office at the law firm, Olivia sat in silence, watching the live broadcast end. Her assistant, Marla, hovered nearby, clearly expecting her to comment. When Olivia didn't speak, Marla took a cautious step forward. "Well?" Marla ventured. "What do you think?" Olivia turned off the screen and folded her hands on the desk. "It's a start," she said after a moment. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was an undertone of determination that Marla recognized well. It was the tone Olivia used when she was ready to fight for something bigger than herself. "Do you believe he meant it?" Marla asked. Olivia tilted her head, considering. "I think he's starting to understand the gravity of what he's done. But an apology is just words. Actions will tell us whether he's really learned anything." Marla nodded, sensing that Olivia's mind was already moving ahead, strategizing the next steps. "The press is going to want a response," Marla reminded her. "They're already calling to ask for a statement." Olivia leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "We'll give them one," she said. "But it won't just be about me. This incident has to become a turning point, not just for Donovan, but for the department, for the city." Marla hesitated. "Do you want me to set up a press conference?" "No," Olivia said firmly. "Not yet. First, I want to meet with the mayor and the police chief. If we're going to make real change, it has to come from the top." The next day, Olivia sat in a conference room at City Hall, flanked by her attorneys and community leaders. Across the table were Mayor Eleanor Watkins and Chief of Police Gregory Stanton. The tension in the room was palpable, but Olivia's presence commanded respect. She was calm, poised, and unflinching. "Dr. Monroe," Mayor Watkins began, her tone diplomatic, "let me start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what happened to you. Officer Donovan's actions were unacceptable, and we're committed to addressing this situation." Olivia nodded but didn't let the mayor's words distract her. "I appreciate that, Mayor Watkins," she said. "But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows incidents like this to happen in the first place. I'm not here to settle for an apology. I'm here to demand action." The mayor exchanged a glance with Chief Stanton, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "What kind of action are you suggesting?" Stanton asked cautiously. Olivia leaned forward, her gaze steady. We need comprehensive reform in how this department operates. Implicit bias training, accountability measures, better community engagement, real steps to rebuild trust between the police and the people they serve. The chief's jaw tightened. Those kinds of changes take time, he said. And resources. Chief Stanton, Olivia said sharply, time and resources aren't excuses. They're responsibilities. The public is watching. This is your chance to show them that you're serious about change. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Mayor Watkins spoke. What specifically are you proposing, Dr. Monroe? Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the table. This is a list of initiatives I've drafted with my team, she said. A citizens review board to oversee complaints against the police, mandatory de-escalation training, partnerships with community organizations to foster dialogue. These aren't just suggestions, they're necessities. The mayor opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. This is ambitious, she admitted. But it's not unreasonable. It's a starting point, Olivia said. And if you implement these changes, you won't just be fixing a broken system, you'll be setting an example for cities across the country. While Olivia was pushing for systemic change, Rick Donovan was confronting a very personal reckoning. The public apology had been a first step, but it hadn't erased the weight of what he'd done. He had been placed on administrative leave, giving him ample time to reflect, a luxury he wasn't sure he deserved. Unable to sit at home and stew in his guilt, Rick decided to do something he had never done before, attend a community meeting. The Southside Community Center was hosting a forum to discuss policing and racial bias, and Rick knew he needed to hear what people had to say, even if it was uncomfortable. When he arrived, the room was packed. Residents, activists, and local leaders filled the chairs, their voices a mix of frustration and hope. Rick slipped into the back, keeping a low profile. He recognized a few of his colleagues in uniform, but they avoided his gaze. As the meeting began, speaker after speaker shared their experiences, stories of being profiled, mistreated, or ignored by the very people sworn to protect them. Rick felt a knot tighten in his stomach with every story. He heard echoes of Olivia's calm defiance in the voices of these residents, and it humbled him. At one point, a young man named Jamal stood up. He couldn't have been older than 20, but his voice carried a wisdom beyond his years. We don't hate the police, Jamal said. We just want them to see us. To treat us like people, not threats. Is that really so much to ask? Rick felt his chest tighten. He wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but he knew it wasn't his place. Not yet. Meanwhile, Olivia's efforts were gaining traction. The mayor publicly announced her support for the proposed reforms, and Chief Stanton reluctantly agreed to implement several of them. The Citizens Review Board was the first initiative to move forward, with Olivia herself appointed as an advisor. The media continued to follow the story closely, but Olivia was careful to keep the focus on the larger issues rather than her personal experience. She appeared on national news programs, spoke at rallies, and met with community leaders to build momentum for the reforms. Her calm yet passionate demeanor resonated with people across the country, turning her into a symbol of hope and resilience. But despite her growing influence, Olivia hadn't forgotten about Rick Donovan. She knew that true change required more than institutional reform, it required individuals to confront their own biases and learn from their mistakes. One evening, Olivia received an unexpected visitor. Marla led Rick into her office, his posture tense but respectful. He held his hat in his hands, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. Dr. Monroe, Rick began, his voice steady but quiet, thank you for agreeing to see me. Olivia gestured for him to sit. What brings you here, Officer Donovan? Rick hesitated, then said, I wanted to apologize to you in person. Not because I have to, but because I need to. What I did that night was wrong. I let my assumptions control my actions, and I can't take that back. But I want you to know that I'm trying to learn from it. I want to do better. Olivia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. I appreciate that, Officer Donovan, she said. But apologies are just words. What matters is what you do next. Rick met her gaze, his voice firm. I understand that. And I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Paths of Redemption. The meeting between Olivia Monroe and Officer Rick Donovan marked a pivotal moment. It wasn't a moment of forgiveness or resolution, both knew that such things would take time, if they were even possible, but it was a beginning. A tenuous connection had been established, one that hinted at the possibility of growth, both personal and systemic. For Rick, the encounter was humbling. Olivia's calm yet firm demeanor left an indelible impression on him. Her words, "What matters is what you do next," echoed in his mind long after he left her office. He had spent years believing he was a good cop, someone who upheld the law with integrity. Now, he was faced with the uncomfortable reality that his actions had betrayed those beliefs. He didn't just want to apologize, he wanted to change. The next morning, Rick sat at his kitchen table, staring at the blank notebook in front of him. He had bought it after his meeting with Olivia, inspired by her insistence on action over words. Slowly, he began to write. I've spent 15 years as a police officer, believing that I was serving my community. But I've come to realize that I wasn't really listening to the people I was supposed to protect. I let my assumptions dictate my actions, and those assumptions were wrong. It's time for me to do better, not just as a cop, but as a person. He paused, then underlined the last sentence. It was a start, but he knew words alone wouldn't suffice. He needed to put them into practice. Rick began by seeking out the very community he had alienated. He attended more forums and town hall meetings, not as an officer representing the department, but as a citizen eager to learn. At first, his presence drew skepticism. Many attendees recognized him from the viral video, and their glares spoke volumes. But Rick stayed quiet, listening intently as people shared their experiences. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, Rick approached Jamal, the young man whose words had resonated with him. Jamal eyed him warily, his arms crossed. What do you want? Jamal asked, his tone guarded. Rick hesitated, then said, I want to understand. I want to hear your story, not as an officer, but as a person. Jamal studied him for a moment, then sighed. You really want to know? Fine. Let's talk. They found a quiet corner of the community center, and Jamal began to speak. He told Rick about growing up in a neighborhood where police presence often felt more like surveillance than protection. He shared stories of friends and family members who had been harassed or mistreated, and the fear and anger that came with it. By the time Jamal finished, Rick felt a lump in his throat. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For everything you've been through. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of the solution moving forward. Jamal didn't reply immediately, but the tension in his posture softened. Then prove it, he said. Actions, not words. Meanwhile, Olivia was gaining momentum in her fight for systemic reform. The Citizens Review Board was officially established, and Olivia was named its chair. The board's mandate was clear: to hold the police department accountable, investigate complaints of misconduct, and ensure that officers received the training and support they needed to serve the community effectively. Olivia also launched a series of community workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and law enforcement. These workshops weren't about assigning blame, they were about understanding. Olivia believed that change required both sides to come to the table, even if the conversations were uncomfortable. At the first workshop, Olivia was pleasantly surprised to see Rick in attendance. He sat quietly at the back of the room, taking notes as residents shared their stories and officers spoke about the challenges of their jobs. When it was his turn to speak, Rick stood hesitantly, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but humble. "And I'm here because I want to learn from them. I want to be better, not just as a cop, but as a member of this community." His words were met with cautious applause. Olivia watched him closely, noting the sincerity in his tone. She wasn't ready to trust him completely, but she could see that he was trying. As weeks turned into months, Rick continued to immerse himself in the work of rebuilding trust. He volunteered at youth mentorship programs, partnered with local activists to host neighborhood cleanups, and even enrolled in implicit bias training courses on his own time. Slowly, the community began to see him not just as the officer from the video, but as someone genuinely committed to change. One day, as Rick was leaving a mentorship session, he was stopped by Jamal. "You've been showing up a lot," Jamal said, his tone still skeptical but less hostile than before. "Why?" Rick looked him in the eye. "Because I want to make things right. I know I can't fix everything, but I can try to be better, and maybe inspire others to do the same." Jamal studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's see if you mean it." At the same time, Olivia was navigating her own challenges. While the reforms were making progress, the pushback from some members of the police department was fierce. Chief Stanton, while outwardly supportive, often dragged his feet on implementing changes. Olivia knew that true transformation required more than policies, it required a cultural shift within the department. She decided to reach out to Rick. If anyone could speak to the challenges and opportunities of change from within, it was him. When they met at a coffee shop downtown, Olivia got straight to the point. "Officer Donovan," she said, "I've seen the work you've been doing. It's commendable. But I need your help." Rick raised an eyebrow. "My help?" "You're in a unique position," Olivia explained. "You understand the flaws in the system, but you also understand what it takes to be a cop. If we're going to make these reforms stick, we need allies inside the department. People who can advocate for change from within." Rick considered her words. "You think the department will listen to me? After everything that's happened?" "They'll listen," Olivia said firmly. "Because you're proof that change is possible. And because you have the courage to admit when you're wrong, and do better." Rick nodded slowly. "All right. What do you need me to do?" Together, Olivia and Rick began working to bridge the divide between the police department and the community. Rick became a liaison between the department and the Citizens Review Board, advocating for reforms and addressing concerns from both sides. His colleagues, initially skeptical, began to respect his dedication and willingness to learn. For Olivia, the partnership was a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about progress, however slow or messy it might be. By the end of the year, the changes were undeniable. Complaints against the police had decreased, community engagement had increased, and trust was beginning to be rebuilt. At the final workshop of the year, Olivia stood before a packed room, reflecting on the journey. "This isn't the end," she said. "Change is a process, not a destination. But tonight, I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. And I'm grateful for everyone who has stepped up, not just to demand accountability, but to be part of the solution." Rick stood in the crowd, his heart swelling with both pride and humility. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly making a difference, not just as a cop, but as a human being. A new beginning. The cold December air was sharp against Rick Donovan's skin as he stepped out of the community center, his breath clouding in front of him. He stopped on the sidewalk, taking a moment to reflect on the bustling scene inside. Tonight was the culmination of months of effort, a celebration of the community's progress and the beginning of something bigger. For Rick, it was a chance to look back on how far he had come. The once strained relationship between the police department and the neighborhood was slowly being rebuilt. Thanks to Olivia Monroe's relentless advocacy and Rick's growing role as a bridge between the two sides, the conversation had shifted from confrontation to collaboration. It wasn't perfect, there were still challenges, still resistance, but there was hope. Rick adjusted his jacket and stepped back inside. The hall was packed with people, the warmth of their voices and laughter washing over him. On one side of the room, kids decorated a towering Christmas tree, their faces alight with joy. On the other, adults mingled around tables stacked with food and gifts, the atmosphere one of shared accomplishment. Rick spotted Jamal across the room, surrounded by a group of younger boys. The teenager was animated, his confidence a far cry from the guarded skepticism he'd shown months earlier. Rick smiled, thinking back to their first conversation. Jamal had been right, actions mattered more than words. And now, those actions were beginning to bear fruit. At the front of the hall, Olivia stood behind a podium, her presence commanding as always. She wore a simple black dress and a crimson scarf, her expression a mix of pride and determination. When she spoke, the room quieted, every face turned toward her. "Good evening, everyone," Olivia began, her voice resonant. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating the holidays, we're celebrating this community. Over the past year, we've faced challenges that tested our strength and our unity. But we've also seen what's possible when we come together." Her eyes swept over the crowd, lingering briefly on Rick. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she continued. "It takes time, persistence, and a willingness to listen. It takes people who are brave enough to admit their mistakes and determined enough to learn from them. And tonight, I want to recognize one of those people." Rick's stomach tightened as Olivia gestured for him to join her at the podium. The crowd parted as he walked forward, his footsteps feeling heavier with each step. When he reached her side, Olivia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Officer Rick Donovan," she said, her voice steady, "when we first crossed paths, it was under circumstances that neither of us would have chosen. But what's happened since then is a testament to what's possible when we refuse to let anger or fear define us. You've shown this community, and yourself, that redemption isn't just a word. It's a commitment." Rick felt his throat tighten, but he managed to nod, his voice quiet when he replied. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe." Olivia smiled faintly before addressing the crowd again. "Rick has worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, not just as an officer, but as a member of this community. And while we still have a long way to go, his journey reminds us that change begins with individuals. It begins with the courage to say, 'I was wrong, and I want to do better.'" The room erupted into applause, but Rick barely registered it. He was too focused on the moment, on the weight of Olivia's words and the sense of responsibility they carried. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was just another step forward. Later that evening, Rick found himself standing near the Christmas tree, watching the kids hang ornaments. One little girl, no older than 6, struggled to reach a branch. Rick stepped forward, gently lifting her so she could place the ornament in just the right spot. "Thank you, mister," she said, her smile bright. Rick chuckled. "You're welcome." As he set her down, he turned to find Olivia standing nearby, a cup of cider in her hand. She raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her expression. "Good with kids, huh?" Rick shrugged, a smile tugging at his lips. "They're honest. They let you know exactly where you stand." Olivia nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Kind of like this community." Rick's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "Do you think we've made enough progress?" "I mean, there's still so much to do." "There's always more to do," Olivia said. "But you can't measure progress by perfection. You measure it by impact. And tonight, I see a community that's stronger, more connected. That's progress." Rick glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Jamal, who was now laughing with a group of his peers. "He's come a long way," Rick said, nodding toward the teenager. "So have you," Olivia replied. Rick turned back to her, his brow furrowed. "Do you really believe I've earned the community's trust? Or are they just being polite?" Olivia's expression softened. Trust isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you build, brick by brick, every day. You've laid a foundation, Rick. Now it's up to you to keep building. Rick nodded, her words sinking in. I will, he said quietly. I promise. As the evening wound down, Rick found himself outside again, the cold air bracing but refreshing. The streets were quiet now, the city lights casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. He thought about the year ahead, about the work still to be done, not just within the department, but within himself. For Olivia, the night had been a reminder of why she fought so hard. Seeing the community come together, seeing the seeds of trust being sown, reaffirmed her belief in the power of resilience and unity. But she knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. Inside the community center, Jamal approached Olivia, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Hey, Dr. Monroe, he said, his voice hesitant. Olivia turned to him, her expression warm. What's on your mind, Jamal? I just wanted to say, thanks. For everything. You didn't have to fight for us, but you did. And that means a lot. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder. Jamal, this community deserves someone who believes in it. I'm just glad I could be part of the journey. But remember, this isn't about me, it's about all of us. You included. Jamal nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. I'll do my part, he said. I know you will, Olivia replied. As the clock struck midnight, Rick stood on the corner of the street, looking back at the community center one last time before heading home. The night had been transformative, not just for the neighborhood but for him personally. He wasn't the same man who had pulled Olivia Monroe aside that humid summer evening. He was someone new, someone better. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt at peace. Not because the work was done, but because he had finally found his place in it.